Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hope you all are doing well. Good morning, everybody. We'll be getting started in about 15 minutes or so, just kind of get everything situated. Martha, how are you?
How are you?
Good.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. What's new and exciting?
Oh, not much. Stuck at home. Grad school, just the usual.
Grad school. What are you getting your grad school in? What are you getting your degree in?
Masters of Fine Arts, but it's in sculpture.
Okay.
So yeah,
Nice. Where at?
I'm here at SIU.
SIU?
Yeah.
Nice.
How are you doing? Everybody doing well at home?
Doing well. Doing as best as we can.
Exactly.
Yeah, how was your? I heard you got married, right?
Yeah, last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. How long's your program, Martha?
It's gonna be 3 years. So I just wrapped up my first year. So I have 2 more years to go.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. Are you helping out with this workshop?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm moderating this one.
All
So
right.
we're just waiting on the two presenters to come in.
Okay, that's yeah.
Yeah, because we start at 10. Everything starts at 10:15. So we still got a little bit of time. I jumped in just in case they hopped in early.
Okay.
So.
All right. Yeah, we already have a good group of people here.
So we should be getting started in about 10 minutes or so. Just kind of waiting for people to kind of join in at any point, and waiting for our two presenters to show up. Okay. Now, is the majority of everybody here on the college side or on the high school side of things? And how are you all doing with everything that's been going on for the last year? Feel free to unmute yourself, put in the chat. Awesome. What high school, Whitney? Grand Tool, okay. Trying to get the seniors. That's what I've been hearing from a lot of seniors too, even on the college side. Everyone, they just want to get to graduation at this point. Now, when's the last week for your high schools or for your seniors? Senior last day, perfect. May 27th, so right around the corner. Awesome, awesome. And now, how have you all been handling it? I know it's been a lot of work for you all on the high school side too, and on the college side. Know that you all are doing a great job and doing great work and advocating for your students. I know it's been tough not seeing them in person, but you all are doing a great, great job. Oh, wow. So this is your first year out? Where'd you go for your grad school? EIU, okay. Well, welcome to the counseling family. You're gonna enjoy it here. You got a lot of people behind you to help you out and be with you. I hope to see you in person. I hope to see all of you in person at next year's conference. Hopefully we can have it in person. Well, hope to see you all in person. Already making friends. A lot of EIU alums.
Hello, friends. That was certainly not me on the phone with Steve, just doing some last minute. Wait, your slide is this, and my slide is this. And now I'm like, oh, I was gonna put on a collared shirt and like not look like a. I'll be right back. Alex, is that is my screen being shared in a way?
Yep, I see your screen. I made you and Steve a co-host, so you both should be able to screen share.
Yes. Yeah. No. Thank you so much.
No problem.
What a fantastic keynote, by the way. I'm like so jazzed about Senator Villanueva and Mr. Valdez's presentation. Like, what if makes this one a lot easier. It's like, ooh.
Right. All right. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll at least do like the little housekeeping part to it, and then we'll turn it over right to you guys right away and get started on time. So welcome everybody. My name is Alejandro Campos. I'm with the University of St. Francis. I'm one of the undergraduate admissions counselors here. Again, welcome. This session here about the RISE Act Is a Zoom meeting, so you're welcome to stay on camera, but just again, mute yourself unless Joe or Steve kind of pick on you and ask you to answer, then you can unmute yourself. But IACAC also encourages all attendees to go ahead and rename yourself with your first and last name, organization, and pronouns. If you are able to ask questions, please use the chat feature. I'll go ahead and I'll keep an eye on it, and we will try to get to everything that's allowed during our time. This session is being recorded right now and will be shared once all registrants are done. And everything will be posted on our Sharing the Dream website. IACAC does strive to be inclusive, diverse association of admissions and counseling professionals. We work to support each other and assume positive intent of all colleagues. So it is my pleasure to introduce Joe Freeman. He's the Director of College Counseling at Beacon Academy. And then Steve Landgraf, who is from Michigan State University. He is the primary recruiter and manager of all Illinois recruitment for Michigan State. So without further ado, I turn it over to the both of you, and you both can take it away.
Thanks, Alejandro. Again, as Alejandro mentioned, my name is Joe Freeman. I am the Director of College Counseling at Beacon Academy in Evanston, Illinois. I am also a former co-chair of IACAC's Government Relations Committee. And then Steve.
My name's Steve Landgraf. As was said, I am a manager of Illinois recruitment for Michigan State University. We actually have 2 regional recruiters here in the Chicago area. I basically work in all the counties of Illinois besides Lake and Cook County, and have been at Michigan State for about 5 years now, and worked at Concordia University Chicago before that, and also served on the IACAC Government Relations Committee as a co-chair for 4 years.
Absolutely. And so I think our hope today is, we have about 30 minutes of slides where we're going to talk a little bit about the RISE Act, around the history of the RISE Act, kind of where the RISE Act and the alternative application for state aid is at this moment. Certainly, if you're in Illinois, we will want a call to action at the end. If you were in the keynote, you know exactly what that's going to be. But also, we're really hopeful that there might be some counselors who are doing this work in other states, because I think one of the things we believe is that the work that the RISE Act Coalition did, and we'll have a slide on this later, but I want to say this early and often, IACAC was a small part of a much larger coalition of advocates kind of working on this legislation. So, particularly if you're a college admissions or access professional doing the work in other states, we're also hopeful that this might provide a nice template for how to move these conversations forward, particularly in states and areas that maybe don't have the same sort of commitment to a welcoming and inclusive space that we've seen, at least in recent years, in Illinois. Steve?
Thank you, Joe. So to set the stage, we want to talk a little bit more broadly about what is going on at the national level and in individual states. And then obviously focus a little bit more on Illinois and what we have observed in Illinois. And as Joe said, hopefully have a conversation about maybe what some of you are hearing in other states or doing in other states. But currently, as you might already know, there is no federal aid that's available to our undocumented students here in the US. There's obviously been a lot of legislation and discussion about that at the federal level, but currently nothing available through the FAFSA for our undocumented students. But there's a wide patchwork, and we'll show you a map in a second. We know a lot of you are obviously visual folks, but this is more of a list of looking at, just broadly speaking, that there's a very interesting patchwork of what the rules are in different states. And sometimes they're not always logical of how you think it would flow through. But 21 states, including Illinois, do allow for students, no matter what their immigration status, to pay in-state tuition rates at post-secondary institutions. Then we have 14 states, including Illinois, that provide access to state financial aid to students who meet certain criteria, regardless of their immigration status. That's where we transition into the RISE Act more specifically here in a few minutes. But then you also have some states that even extend to offering institutional aid and scholarships for undocumented students. And Illinois is one of that group too. So Illinois is really very forward thinking and accommodating to students. Obviously, we'd love to see this carry over to more states, but for lack of a consistent federal guideline here, this is really left up to the states. And if we go to the next slide here, I think this makes a more striking picture, especially maybe like mine, your eyes are drawn to those states in the red colors and you're like, what's the deal with those states? So you see that a few states ban enrollment to undocumented students, or whole college systems denying enrollment to undocumented students. You see the states in like the neon green that have tuition equity policies at major institutions. You know, another Big Ten school, University of Michigan in Michigan, has their own kind of unique policies for undocumented students. I know in Michigan. You know, whereas you see the dark green of states with tuition equity laws or policies and some state financial aid. So it's a really vast, different patchwork. And again, it's not always consistent of how you might think it might flow through. So I would encourage you to check out this National Immigration Law Center page. They have a lot of information. They have a whole chart, and maybe we can share that at some point here too, the link. They have a whole chart that shows you all the different bills in all these different states, you know, and that can be a great roadmap, so to speak, of looking at what other states have done. As you connect with legislators, potentially, that can sometimes be a roadmap of saying, hey, this state has done this and it's been really effective. Can we do something like that? That's a great way to sometimes start a conversation, is to look at legislation that has passed or been successful in other states. So again, there's a whole chart on the National Immigration Law Center site, but I think this map is really striking. But as we get into Illinois more specifically, the RISE Act, that's what we're here to talk about primarily, is what we've learned through this process to, again, kind of provide a roadmap, because hopefully this session will inspire you to get more involved and get in the game and be more involved in this process, and we can share some of our stories. As Joe said, we were a small part in this, and I think that should be one of your takeaways from this, is that it really takes a coalition of different groups and sometimes even different policies, different constituents to really get things done. So the RISE Act, the Retention of Illinois Students and Equity Act, provides that students who are Illinois residents and not otherwise eligible for federal need-based financial aid shall be eligible for state financial aid and benefits. Students benefiting from this expansion include undocumented students, students with certain types of drug convictions, and transgender students assigned male at birth and unable to meet the selective service requirement. So maybe you all weren't familiar with all of those details in terms of what the RISE Act covers. And that's some of what we're going to unpack here today, is sort of how having a broad focus for this piece of legislation helped to finally get it across the finish line when it was kind of stalled out at different points in the process. So I will kick it back to Joe here for our next slide.
Yes, and I think we'll start with really just making sure we all know what the RISE Act created. And the RISE Act created the alternative application for Illinois financial aid. This is an application that allows qualifying undocumented students, transgender students who are not otherwise eligible for federal financial aid to apply for the Illinois Monetary Award Program. And these are need-based grants administered by the Illinois, by ISAC. And those MAP grants can go towards tuition at any eligible Illinois college, university, or career education program. Generally, that is both public and private, not-for-profit 2- and 4-year programs. There's actually some legislation in the General Assembly currently that is aiming to prohibit MAP grants from going to certain for-profit organizations and institutions. And so I very much appreciate the work that our state legislators are doing in not only making sure that MAP grants are available for all Illinois students, but also making sure that our taxpayer money isn't going towards waste, fraud, or abuse, which I think you can sometimes find in for-profit programs. The link just right here at the bottom, this is the link to the alternative application for Illinois financial aid. I will say that while ISAC is a public organization, many of our non-public or our private universities have been instrumental in helping ISAC kind of create this alternative application. I want to give specific shout out to Alejandro's employer, University of St. Francis, who I think has been a national leader in working with undocumented students for as long as I've been in Illinois. And I think that our state benefits from all of us, right? Whether we're working in the public sector or the private sector, we're all very much committed to making sure that these opportunities are available for any student who wants them. So particularly if you work on my side of the desk and you are not familiar with how to counsel students towards this application, ISAC has done a fantastic job creating resources. There are videos on the ISAC website, and then a huge shout out to ISAC Core. And if you do not know who the ISAC Core members are, how they're assigned in your community college district, please contact Sarah and the other folks at ISAC. They will partner you with a core member, and those people are instrumental really in helping counselors as well in terms of understanding this. I know that financial aid counseling, and I speak for myself as a school-based counselor, like financial aid counseling is some of the hardest counseling I do and some of the counseling I am least trained for. So utilizing ISAC as a resource is, I think, instrumental in sort of the work we do day to day with students and families. So as Steve alluded to, this took a village, right? Getting the RISE Act passed was hard. It was, and you'll see in a future slide, it was a 20-year process. And the Illinois Association for College Admission Counseling played a small part. I don't think we can continue or say anything about the RISE Act without talking about the incredible people at the University of Illinois Chicago, who really did spearhead this, right? If you know Tanya Cabrera, and if you don't know Tanya Cabrera, go out and meet this woman, an incredible inspiration and one of the most fantastic educators I've ever encountered. But UIC, PASO, the National Immigrant Justice Center, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Once the transgender piece of this got added in, Equality Illinois, I mean, this was a large coalition of groups and organizations that had not only been working on this issue, but have been working on this issue from a space of lived experience and from a space of really working in communities and with individual students and families. The way that IACAC did play a role, and I do think it is important to kind of define sort of how we as an organization participated. We did go to strategy sessions. We were invited in for those task force strategy sessions, and that allowed our organization to help, right? And again, not help from the center, but help from the position of practitioners, right? People who are actually on the front lines of helping students transition from secondary to post-secondary studies as admissions counselors, as school-based counselors, as CBO counselors. We had that firsthand knowledge of what it means and what it's like to sit with a student and family and be like, okay, you're undocumented, or you're from a mixed status family, or you are transgender and you can't fulfill that selective service requirement. It really allowed us to, again, as Mr. Valdez said in the keynote, it allowed us to use our stories. And it allowed us to also talk about, know exactly where some of those challenge points were. And so one thing that we did do as an organization is we provided very effective advocacy language for these lead organizations, right? Sort of being able to talk to, ICIRR about, okay, well, this is actually what it looks like when you're sitting with a student and family. And so how about we, in that one pager that we're handing out to our elected officials, why don't we sort of hit on these particular points? We also did, I think, within that task force, help expand the scope of the bill to include transgender students. And I'll be very honest, and we'll have another slide on this later. That inclusion was a bit opportunistic. We couldn't have included transgender students in the way that we had were we in the Obama administration. But once the Trump administration decided that transgender students were no longer qualified to serve in the military, all of a sudden it opened up the selective service requirement issue. And therefore we were able to bring in a whole different group of students that had not been considered in previous iterations of this bill. And we had a lot of co-sponsorship. And again, Equality Illinois became a pretty significant partner in the work after that happened. I do want to make sure that we and the last thing is that, I mean, I went back to advocacy agendas for years and years and years. This has always been a very important part of our advocacy agenda. In 2019, it was all we went to advocate for. I mean, not to say that we wouldn't talk about our normal spiel, right? Strengthening MAP, making sure there are more school counselors in buildings. I mean, these are things we go and talk about all the time. But I think I can speak for myself. When I went to talk to my elected officials, it was about 2691, right? Like, this was the thing that I wanted most to talk about because we could see that momentum building. Do want to note, we did not testify before committees, right? I am a cisgender white man, and it is not, I should never center myself or my experience when having these discussions. I can talk about my experience as a professional, but I always need to make sure, particularly in advocacy, that the stories I'm telling are stories about students who are directly impacted. We did not take the lead on advocacy, though I will note in that 2019 session, we were the first organization to have an advocacy day after the bill's introduction. And our timing was good because we were able to sort of really hit the ground and work with Representative Hernandez and the other legislators who were central to sort of moving the bill. And again, in our conversations with our individual elected officials, we were able to have, again, bring on more co-sponsorship, really help move this bill forward in a fairly quick way. So I think that the sort of the big takeaway from this is that if you're sitting in here as a counselor, you need to be in the room because you're the access expert, right? Your experience as an admissions professional or a school counselor or a CBO counselor or a graduate student, wherever you are in your own professional journey, you're an expert on this issue. And so it's always important to remember that elected officials, whether at the state or the national level, it's quite rare that an elected official actually knows the work that we do. They know we exist, right? Of course, they're like, oh, well, like school counselors are important, but they don't actually know sort of the day-to-day. And so, I would encourage people who are engaging in advocacy to really think about this, not just as a counselor, but as a teacher, right? And your job is to teach your elected officials about the work you do, and why a specific piece of legislation matters or will make that work easier. And the third point, and we'll get back to this over and over again, is that don't let a letter next to an elected official's name scare you off. Every single legislator, regardless of their political party affiliation or the nonsense they say in television, cares about educational options in their district. They want strong schools in their district. They want, especially if there's a college or university in their district, they do not want that college or university to close, because the closure of colleges and universities have significant economic repercussions. And so it's great to use your inside knowledge strategically. It's important to sort of have a sense of your elected official, and what the issues on the ground in your community are, right? When I talk to my state rep, I know that she knows the same high schools and stores and neighborhoods and issues that I do, because we live down the street from each other. And so remember, as you have those conversations from the point of view of, oh, I know this community just as well as my elected official, but I know something that my elected official doesn't know, which is how it actually works in terms of helping a student transition from secondary to post-secondary study, or if you're in the transfer world, helping students through that transfer process as well. And so, oh yeah, go ahead, Steve. Told you I would. I told you I'd jump on your slide.
This is a lot of information. I'm not going to read through all of this. I don't necessarily expect you to read through all of this. But this is, as Joe said, this is a long saga. If you look at kind of how you build the foundation, lay the brickwork, to getting a piece of legislation like this done and having it evolve. And a lot of it is impacted by the elected officials. We think of Illinois as being a pretty blue state, a pretty Democratic controlled state, especially in the General Assembly. But it hasn't always been that way, and it hasn't always been that way in terms of the governor's mansion. Rod Blagojevich was the governor from 2003 to 2009, Democrat. Things didn't go so well for him. That would be another session if you don't already know. Then Pat Quinn became governor when Rod Blagojevich was removed. He was governor from 2009 to 2015. And then Bruce Rauner came in as a Republican from 2015 to 2019. And then J.B. Pritzker was elected and became governor in 2019. Obviously, at the federal level, we had different things kind of playing out in the federal narrative too. But as this speaks to a little bit, and as we've already alluded to, I think, building that coalition is important. And sometimes there are roadblocks in terms of who is the governor, who's going to have to sign off on that legislation or have a veto overridden. And higher education definitely was impacted while Bruce Rauner was governor from 2015 to 2019. We try very hard with IACAC and our government relations work, as Joe said, to not think so much about the letter behind someone's name. And we are not a partisan organization. We can't endorse a candidate or anything of that nature. But we know that Governor Rauner had a different vision for education and education funding, and wasn't always able to build a coalition with especially the Democrats, but even some folks from his own party in terms of kind of getting things done in terms of a budget. There was a budget impasse, and in terms of the funding needed for education. So I think that plays into this timeline here of knowing that some institutions of higher education really kind of suffered over time in Illinois in terms of the brain drain, in terms of lower enrollment. So I think that provided the space where something like the RISE Act could be a more attractive option, no matter what party you were a part of, because you were looking at the issues Illinois was facing in terms of retention of our students, in terms of that brain drain, in terms of declining enrollment, especially at some of those state public institutions, that kind of made it into a broader issue that maybe people, based on that letter behind their name, maybe wouldn't have stereotypically been for something like the RISE Act, or wouldn't have had advocacy for undocumented students as a top position for them. But when you sort of reframe it in terms of the context that we've been in Illinois, that made it a more attractive space to have the legislation passed.
So yeah, and I think, Steve, you did a really nice job kind of hitting on these points, but you saw that timeline of years, right, of the Illinois Access Bill not quite moving or not getting the support that it needed in the 99th and 100th General Assembly. And really in 2019, with the 101st General Assembly, there were a confluence of factors that really allowed the bill to move, right? First, the new governor, right? I mean, we knew that Governor Pritzker would want to sign this bill, whereas Governor Rauner would have vetoed it. And so, having a more, knowing that the legislation would move in, would pass into law, a little bit more smoothly, or having a sense of that was important. And you know what, like, all credit to the lead organizations on this for really working collaboratively with the governor's office from day one, especially Deputy Governor Ruiz, right? Where we knew that there were going to be stronger advocates from the executive side than there had been from 2015 to 2019. As Steve noted, the budget impasse really wrecked Illinois public university budgets. And so I think what happened was moderate Democrats or downstate Democrats who might have been a little bit more on the fence on this issue, worrying about their own reelection chances in a bit more of a conservative part of the state, were no longer on the fence, because not only did they have, essentially they had the cover to make the right moral decision, right? Which is, of course, we want to provide support for these students. Of course, we want to provide support for our education system, but now it's an economic issue, right? Because if, Eastern or Western or SIU Carbondale continue to lose students, that's not just bad for those institutions, that's bad for Charleston, that's bad for Macomb, that's bad for Carbondale and Edwardsville, that's bad for DeKalb. And so really having a recognition of the larger economic consequences of just losing students was important. Again, I never want to credit the Trump administration for much of anything, but it was galvanizing, right? When whether it was that sort of build the wall rhetoric, or whether it was the ban on transgender military service, all of a sudden, I think Illinois elected officials were much more courageous in taking a stand against that, and not just Democrats, even more moderate Republicans became, I think, a little bit more aware of the destruction of those policy choices from the federal level that was causing. And then, while again the MAP grant goes to all public and private institutions and follows the students, leadership from Illinois public universities, and not just in this round too. I mean, if you go back to 2015 for the initial Illinois Access Bill, the UI system, so Springfield, Urbana-Champaign, and Chicago were all central in really sort of having these conversations and moving this bill forward. But I will also say that I think our organization was particularly pleased to see sort of the ultimate success of RISE include MAP expansion, whereas other iterations left MAP out of it, was much more focused on institutional aid. So lesson 3, right? Success does not happen overnight. And particularly if you're coming at this work from another state. And I will, as Steve was talking, I remember moving to Illinois in 2016 from Alabama. And trust me, having these conversations in Montgomery was very, very different than having these conversations in Springfield, where in Montgomery, you're just trying to make the argument that undocumented students should have some access somehow to public institutions of higher education. And currently in Alabama, that's not the case. Undocumented students have to continue their studies at private universities in Alabama or leave the state. And so I guess I just sort of mentioned that is like, even in Illinois, and Steve, I don't want to reiterate this point, but I think it's important to note, so I will reiterate this point. This takes a long time, and as a future slide is going to tell you, the work continues. We're not done. There's a lot more to be done. We just learned about 2 important pieces of legislation this morning that represents this work continuing. I also think it was, the RISE Act was most successful when it became about more than undocumented students. And that's not to say that undocumented students shouldn't sit at the center of this work. It absolutely should. But including transgender students, including students with federal drug convictions, where that would disqualify them from federal aid, removing the cap on hours too. So maybe that student, utilized some of their MAP money. It didn't quite go their way because, hey, there wasn't the resources on their campuses to ensure their success. Remember, our work is not just about access. It is about success. It reinstated some of that MAP money. And so by broadening sort of the umbrella of people positively impacted by the act, it made it an easier sell with our elected officials. And remember, like, Illinois is not out of the woods in terms of financial issues, right? I mean, trust me, MAP is not a stable appropriation, as we all know. But being able to sort of expand MAP in this way, and it was paired with a $50 million expansion of the program, thanks to Governor Pritzker as well, is important. And while, yes, we are a nonpartisan organization, I'll quote my own state representative by saying what a difference a governor makes. And that was really, really successful for this bill. And so the economic needs and realities of our state really did lead to this success. Steve?
So final takeaways as we wrap up and hopefully have some brief discussion here. Some of you are already very involved in this work, and thank you for being involved and giving up your time. I mean, we all have full-time jobs, and the things we do with IACAC or the things we do as a citizen to just get involved in the legislative process, that's all an extra thing, and we all have a lot on our plate, so thank you for being involved. And some of you have probably never talked to an elected official, maybe never been to Springfield or your state capital. This hasn't been your thing, and hopefully you're thinking maybe you can kind of get more involved. So again, find the organizations that are already doing work and join with them. It takes those partnerships together, amongst different organizations. We as IACAC in the past year have really tried to partner more with different organizations like the Illinois School Counselor Association. It takes finding those common bonds, because having more voices to advocate for an issue, as you've seen from these slides already, is very, very important. As Joe has said several times, we're experts in this. You may not know how the General Assembly works. You may not even know right now who your elected officials are. And that's okay. Like you can figure that stuff out. And we have folks who would love to help you. We love to talk about this stuff. But you are an expert in what you do in terms of working with students and being able to share those stories and show firsthand how something like the RISE Act and other legislation impacts your students directly, whether you work for a CBO or a college or high school, or if you're an independent counselor. We all have stories about how these things are impacting our students, or even our own stories. I went to Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. I wish we were in Carbondale directly for this session. I got a Pell Grant. I got a MAP grant. And I share that story with elected officials all the time, how I'm so grateful that I got those benefits and was able to take advantage of those resources so I could afford to go to college at a great school like SIU Carbondale. So that kind of transitions into number 3, talk about your lived experiences. We all have a story about how we found a college, the obstacles we encountered, how we paid for college, the sacrifices we had to make. We all have those personal stories. But again, we have so many stories of how we see that affecting students every day, and how the climate of who the governor is, who the president is, that really has an impact on our students. We've seen that. We have so many of those stories. As Joe mentioned before, don't let whether an elected official is a Democrat or a Republican, or you may feel very, very strongly about an issue that your elected official is completely opposed on. Maybe you disagree with them on every issue, but when it comes to educational issues, there's probably going to be some common ground. Most of us agree that education is important, that it's a big game changer in terms of your ability to get a job and an ability to support yourself. And so there's different ways to talk about that in terms of sometimes when you're talking to an elected official that is a Republican versus a Democrat, for instance, you might focus a little bit more on that return on investment, and on that being having that fiduciary responsibility with those taxpayer dollars, and the fact that if we are paying to educate students and they're leaving the state, not being able to stay in Illinois, that's a problem, and you can bring things back to jobs. Most people agree on jobs. Colleges, as Joe mentioned, are a huge economic driver, especially in smaller areas like a Carbondale or Charleston, so when you can center things talking about those economic issues, that can sometimes get a little more traction. And depending on who you're talking to, you may make more of that emotional appeal and talking about how it is important that undocumented students should be entitled to get a good education. Whereas with other elected officials, you may, again, focus on that economic impact in terms of higher enrollment at institutions, retention, creating jobs. There's different ways to frame the issue. And I think that that's sort of what we've alluded to throughout this presentation here. So I would really encourage you to get involved. We would always hear when we do events with NACAC and IACAC, the elected officials work for you. You are paying their salary. They work for you. They're elected to represent you. You may not agree with them on everything, and that's okay, but they are elected to work for you. So they're entitled to give you some of their time. And maybe you can reach out to them about House Bill 3438.
Yes, I just want to, and I saw Alejandro put the link in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that. But if you get nothing else out of today, well, hopefully you're going to get a lot out of today. But one thing we would strongly encourage you to do today is to weigh in on 3438. We need those witness slips, before the bill heads to executive committee today at 2:30. You can also watch that virtually on the ILGA website. I'm not going to say that I've watched some virtual committee meetings this spring, but I absolutely have. It's actually quite fascinating. The other thing is get on the phone, right? Call your state senator, call your state senator's office. You can find their contact information on the Illinois Policy Institute website. And that's pretty accurate. We are in a remap, so that will change soon. But right now, you should know who that state senator is. Give them a call, ask them to support this bill, send them an email, connect with them on social media. It's really important, I think, that your elected officials hear from you as counseling and advocacy experts on this issue. And even if, even if this doesn't affect you directly, to paraphrase a much greater mind than my own, my liberation is bound with the liberation of my students. And so that's something that I really hold close to my own heart and would encourage folks to do as well. Now we're to the questions phase. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We have about 10 minutes and would love to feel, to engage in conversation, whether it's about this particular presentation or maybe even if you had questions coming out of the keynote or the keynotes as well. Anything on people's minds? You can use the raise hand function too. Steve, we just did too good a job.
I did share that Illinois policy website on there where you can look up your state rep or senator. Don't feel embarrassed if you don't know who they are. And it's pretty easy to find that out even if you're in a different state. There are lots of tools where you can look up based on your address who your state representative, state senator is.
Yep. And I will also say, and this is something that people do all the time, if you're like thinking about that in terms of I need to call Senator Durbin or Senator Duckworth, those are your nationally elected officials, or those folks represent us in Washington. You're going to want to look for the people who represent you in Springfield.
Right. And it's different than it is the federal level where it's not just, two senators in Springfield for all of Illinois. It's more kind of like you have a representative for where you live and you have a senator for where you live. Whereas if we're in Illinois, all of us have Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin as our senators. But yes, there are also tools where you can look up who your representative in Congress in the House of Representatives is too.
Questions or comments too. I mean, I'm looking at the audience here. I'm like, oh, there are some big players here. So I want to make sure that, I'm leaving space for a lot of other voices who I think were very deeply involved in this work from day one. Oh yeah, Martha.
Yeah, I had a question in regards like how the implementing, obviously I know a lot of the history and the process that we've gotten to today, where students can apply. I've looked at the application, I've seen that. Do you have any sort of updates in regards to like how the implementing of this bill happened in Illinois as we transitioned into like, you know, finding that financial need for those students?
I mean, I think the data is still out. So the bill went in, effectively became law in January of 2020, January 1st, 2020, is I think those of us who know that's kind of like not exactly on cycle with financial aid. And so and it's funny that you mentioned, because I was looking at the ISAC website to see whether I could see any numbers or statistics. Particularly around who has utilized the RISE Act or the alternative application. And I know that they will publish this data because ISAC is actually great at publishing this data. I also know that individual institutions are starting to get a good sense of the data. I know the number has been in the thousands, at least from what I've heard. And now I'm like, I feel like somebody else on this call is going to have this information that I don't. And so in terms of like how the actual implementation went, I think I don't want to say fits and starts. I mean, it was a little bit like, we were waiting for the application and then the application went live. My understanding is that the implementation and rollout has been quite smooth, but again, that is all credit to the Illinois Students Assistance Commission. I mean, really, they have taken the lead on that as a state organization. And then, of course, individual institutions utilizing that data to make those MAP awards. I also know that, and again, a school counselor, correct me if I'm wrong, we have not yet hit the worst day of the year, which is the day that MAP announces the suspension of MAP grants. So I believe that those applications are still open. So particularly if you're working with students who are still very much in this process or in the summer, or like, I really want to continue my education, that money is still out there. But every year there is a date that ISAC announces that there will be no more new MAP grants awarded until October 1st of 2021, which is when the financial aid cycle resets. Did that answer your question, Martha, or was I?
Yeah, I think there's still, I guess, from your point, there's still a lot of research and collecting of data that we still need. I mean, it's still freshly new, so I can understand, like, we're still kind of collecting that information as we go.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I have heard thousands, but I don't have a specific number. Again, and like, let's stop and kind of reflect on that as fairly incredible, right? Like, our state just made college more affordable for thousands of students for whom it wasn't before January 1st, 2020.
Yeah, and I think it also really just depends on the information that a counselor has, depending on where they're located. I know for Southern Illinois, it's very different, and those access resources aren't really available to they're there, but it's just, sometimes they lack that information. And so it's hard to help students in that sense.
I also know that sometimes it can be harder in communities to have those conversations too. And I'll speak as a high school counselor, right? I don't get a list of my undocumented students, right? Nor should I. And so that requires me to build relationships that are trusting, that I openly communicate with my families, that if they are an undocumented student or they're a student from a mixed status background, that my office is a safe place to disclose that should they choose. And to be honest with you, I've used IACAC, tremendously to help me in that, right? Because again, you look at me and you're like, oh, I don't know about that guy, right? Pink shirt, like, what's that about, right? But, the reality is that butterfly's on my door. And I make sure that any presentation I give to any of my student populations, and I know I see Ryan Everett here who knows my school a little bit. Like, I don't have a large population of undocumented students, but I do have a population of undocumented students. So, will 92% of my families listen to information that does not apply to them? Yes, they will, because for the 8% to whom it does apply, they need that information.
We have about 2 more minutes, about maybe one more question.
I wanted to ask about if there's potentially any talk or legislation or advocacy to change the 3-year requirement for the RISE Act. I've had a couple students who don't meet the criteria because maybe they've only been here for a year or two. And so obviously that's been a hindrance for them. I know this is fairly new. We should celebrate that we've able to help the students that we're able to help, but that definitely has been a hurdle for some of the students that I've worked with before.
I will speak for myself. Brendan, that was the first. Thank you for raising that. I do think that that's actually important feedback to share, not only with ISAC, but with our elected officials as we continue, because again, we, as this bill has just, fairly been newly implemented, I think we're still learning about maybe where are those pitfalls or those blind spots in terms of the construction of the legislation. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a really good conversation to have. And so I would encourage you to share your experience with our current government relations chairs as well, because that is definitely something that I know now, just being a member of that committee, is something that we can and will discuss and bring back to our elected officials.
All right, thank you all for showing up today. In the chat, I put in there the link for those of you that need the professional development hours. The link's in there, so go ahead and complete that form. But I want to thank Joe and both Steve for an awesome presentation. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference today. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.